Well, thank you very much. I'm not a nutrition scientist, and that may be an advantage, because there's been every week in the newspaper, we read something is good for you, and the same thing the next week is bad for you. For the last 14 years, we've been conducting a large epidemiological study called PURE in 17 countries. Now it's expanded to 200 countries with 200,000 people. We have about 825,000 years of follow-up. We collected diet using validated food frequency questionnaires on macronutrients, which I'd speak. We estimated sodium intake using urinary sodiums, and fruits and vegetables were estimated. And for a long time, there's data that they're good, but the issue is, why are they not used? So these are the data on macronutrients. And what is plotted here, and this is the same format I'm going to use, is percent of the nutrient, in this case carbohydrates, the quantiles, odds ratios, and their confidence limits. And one of the things to notice is that using the lowest quintile as the reference, as increasing carbohydrate intake occurs, there is an increasing risk of cardiovascular disease. This is the one thing that's important, because the previous guidelines said reduce fats and compensate for it with carbohydrates. So essentially, we've increased carbohydrate intake in most Western countries, and this is likely damaging. We were in for a big surprise. We actually found that increasing fats were protective. Now, these are all fats, and so this very first slide challenges the WHO and the AHA guidelines on diet. So these are spline equations of the carbohydrate intake, and once you get past about 40% or about 55% of carbohydrate intake as percent energy, there's a steep increase in the risk of cardiovascular disease. The WHO guidelines say that up to about 75% of carbohydrates is okay, but that is wrong. Again, total fats, if anything, is protective, and the reason for this are twofold. Too low fat is inadequate. Too high fat is probably bad, and the original studies from Finland was at extremely high fat levels, not the usual fat levels that populations consume. Then if you look at the types of fats, saturated fats, you will see there's really no clear pattern. If anything, within the normal range, saturated fats are not harmful, may even be slightly beneficial, but there is no harm. Monounsaturated fatty acids, which is in olive oil, canola oil, and is part of the key of the Mediterranean diet, you get clear benefit. Polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is largely from vegetable oils, and remember that is processed oil, is largely neutral. You've got to think of the change in oils that have occurred in the world in the last 30 years. It was entirely industry-driven. You know, they went from natural fats, which is animal fats, to vegetable fats because they can produce it and therefore charge for it. And this was swallowed hook, line, and sinker by the AHA, and the WHO just repeated it. So fundamentally, our fat story is some fats are good, some fats may be neutral, but it's carbohydrates that is the worst thing. The other thing is, in the US, there is this big swing to reduce milk consumption, and even if you consume milk, they want you to consume 2% or 1% of fat. What is the evidence? A big, big zero. Absolutely no evidence that low-fat milk is better for you. If anything, if you look at dairy sources of saturated fats, it is protective. If you look at meat sources of saturated fats, it's neutral. And if you look at white meat, this is chicken and fish, there's a trend towards benefit. So red meats in moderate quantities are not bad, and white meats may be moderately beneficial, but dairy fats such as cheese are probably good for you, and milk, there really is no data at all to reduce the fat content of milk. Now, why did we go wrong? We went wrong because of surrogate endpoints. The story on saturated fats versus LDL is consistent. Our data shows that as you increase the amount of saturated fats, your LDL goes up. But look at how much the LDL goes up. This is 150,000 people in the analysis, from about 2.85 to just under 3, about 0.1 millimoles over a huge range of percentage saturated fat. But cardiovascular disease shows exactly the opposite endpoint. This is what dominated the guidelines. This wasn't achieved. There have been so many randomized trials of fat reduction, and other than societies like the Norwegian old study, where saturated fats were very high, reducing them did lead to benefits. But the Women's Health Initiative, where total fats as well as saturated fats were reduced, showed no benefit. That is a huge study of 49,000 women followed for 7 years. Now, what about carbohydrate intake? If you look at LDL, which is not this, there will be an inverse relationship. But if you look at ApoB by ApoA, which today we know is the most sensitive marker for risk factor prediction, risk prediction, there is a steep increase. You'll see this from about 0.72 to nearly 0.85, a much bigger increase. Whereas if you take, this is with carbohydrate intake, you'll see a steep increase. With saturated fats, if anything, it is neutral or tending to go down. So depending on the surrogate marker, you can make different kinds of extrapolations. If you look at monounsaturated fats and look at ApoB by ApoE, look at the steep decrease from about 0.8 down to about 0.72. So the ApoB, ApoA story tracks with the risk factors better than the LDL story. And with poly, it is pretty flat. Now, what about salt, blood pressure, and CVD? This has been an area, again, of great controversy, largely because of the surrogate endpoint story. There is no doubt that increasing blood pressure, salt intake increases blood pressure. And what we've done here is, in order to do really large studies of salt and cardiovascular disease, you had to measure salt intake in a simple way. You can't do repeat 24-hour urines. So we developed a method of fasting morning urine samples, and this is a validation study with 1,083 people from 11 countries and showed a very high correlation. So it's not perfect. So, for instance, we do epidemiology with cuff blood pressure in a clinic versus outcomes. For sure, 24-hour blood pressure shows you a steeper relationship, but it doesn't change the direction of the relationship. So what is plotted here are two things. One is the measured 24-hour urine excretion. This is the estimated 24-hour excretion from the single morning fasting urine, and you'll see versus blood pressure, the correlation is the same. So you can substitute a simple morning urine test for a 24-hour urine test for population studies, not to measure the salt in an individual. And we then published our first paper from the on-target study, which was a secondary prevention trial where we had first morning urine, 30,000 people, 4,700 events, and we saw a J-shaped curve. The lowest or the optimal threshold was somewhere between 3 and 6. Above it, there was an increased mortality. Below it, there was an increased mortality. And we did everything to adjust this away, including what is called reverse confounding. And the standard way of adjusting for reverse confounding is you remove people with cardiovascular disease, which we couldn't do in this study, but you take away the first year, the second year, because those who change their diet because of disease, the effect will only be early. And in fact, most people don't change their diet anyway on salt. Then we did the pure study on 102,000 people without disease, using the same method, and look exactly the same relationship. And it's exactly in the same region that we are finding the lowest trough. The same thing for the composite of cardiovascular events, 3,300 events, or death from any causes, again, the same relationship, and major CVD events, the same relationship. So 2 independent studies, 2 different populations, exactly the same results. And in this study, we can exclude reverse causality because we were able to exclude the 7,000 out of the 100,000 people who had cardiovascular disease. We also excluded the diabetics. The results got even stronger. So reverse causality and confounding couldn't deal with it. We then had other studies in which we had measured urine sodium, and we pooled it, and this was published last year in The Lancet. This is on 133,000 people. The first thing is we saw an association of sodium and blood pressure in hypertensives, which was twice as steep as that in non-hypertensives. So hypertension per se identifies somebody who's salt sensitive. And that is true for systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. And these slopes are identical to the literature on 24-hour urine blood pressure and blood pressure. 24-hour urine salt and blood pressure. So we're getting exactly the same relationship. And when you pool the data on 133,000, you get this J-shaped curve. Now, we then divided those into hypertensives, where we have 6,800 events. Here we had 10,000 events. And you will see in those above 5 grams, there is an increase in CVD risk. But below 5 grams, there is, again, an increase. And there are several studies, 21 studies on last count in the literature, that shows this and also shows an increase in the activation of the renin-angiotensin system that Hans Brunner showed 40 years ago. Mickey Alderman and his group again showed that from John Larag's lab. But if you take people without hypertension, you do not get this increase at the top end. You actually get the same increase at the bottom end. What does this mean? First, that only a level over 5 grams is adverse, and it's only adverse in people who are hypertensive. So if somebody is hypertensive, takes a lot of salt, makes a lot of sense to reduce it. If somebody's not hypertensive, leave them alone. Now, you'll wonder about this J-shaped curve and stop and think for a minute. Sodium is an essential part of diet. It's teleologically necessary. We all see patients with low sodium who have hypotension, and we tell them to take sodium. If you take animal models, you will see marked activation of the renin-angiotensin system, both in animals and humans, at low sodium. Sodium is also important for other homeostatic factors. The first line of defense to external infection in the skin is sodium. That is why the largest part of sodium in the body is stored under the skin in the subcutaneous lymphatics. And if you take an animal model and you make a wound in one limb, but not the other limb, within 1 hour, the level of sodium in the injured limb doubles. Because increasing sodium locally at the site of injury prevents infection. So, all essential nutrients have a physiological range. Too high is bad, too low is bad. Too high obesity, weight is bad, too low is bad. Too high hemoglobin is bad, too low is bad. Too high thyroxine is bad, too low is bad. And you can keep on going. So why on earth do the epidemiologists think you can lower sodium all the way down to your boots and people will live forever? People have used the data from the Yanomamo Indians to say the lower the sodium, the lower the blood pressure. That is true. But do you know what their mean life expectancy is? 32 years. What do they die of? Not from heart disease, but from infections. So you have to look at the person as a whole. So recently, as recently as 2 weeks ago, the World Heart Federation, the European Society of Hypertension, and the European Public Health Association got together an independent working group. It had 5 Americans, 5 Europeans, and 5 people from Asia, Africa, and South America. And their report is available online in the European Heart Journal. And they concluded that it's 5 grams of sodium and above that is important. And the reason for this is the WHO recommends lowering sodium to 2 or 2.3 3 grams per day. That's completely wrong. So does the AHA. It's completely wrong. Moderate sodium intake, 3 to 5 grams, is optimal. Below 3 grams, there's uncertainty. And the only way we can deal with it is if we have randomized trials. In fact, we don't even have randomized trials above 5 grams to show a reduction in cardiovascular disease. We have trials that show a reduction in blood pressure. And so they recommend adopt an overall healthy pattern, rich in foods containing potassium, fruits and vegetables with moderate intake, and don't go bananas about it. Now let's come to fruits, vegetables, legumes, and CVD. These are our data on increasing consumptions in fruits and vegetables. Where on earth did the concept that we should eat 5 servings of fruits and vegetables come from? Why not 4? Why not 3? Why not 6? Why not 7? And is it all fruits? Is it all vegetables? Is it what kinds of fruits, what kinds of vegetables? And this you will see are people who consume fruits less than once a month. Once a month to once a week. Once a week to 3 times a week. You'll see that it starts to drop and drops all the way up to about 2 fruits to 3 fruits per day. So far good. But do all fruits have this effect? And these are data by tertiles. So this is the all fruit data. Red or purple fruits, similar results. Yellow or orange fruits, similar results. Green fruits, similar results. And now let's look at vegetables. With vegetables, we did not see a protective effect. And you will see this is a reference group. If anything, it was slightly adverse, but I don't believe that is the case. It's probably neutral. And when you look at the literature really is quite inconsistent on the results of vegetable intake versus outcomes. We then asked ourselves, is it the type of vegetables? So when we looked at raw vegetables, maybe a slight trend in favor. Cooked vegetables, no difference. Cruciferous vegetables, no difference. Dark yellow vegetables, no difference. Green leafy vegetables, no difference. Other vegetables, no difference. But I have to tell you regarding diet, neutral is good. You've got to eat something. And if you like it, eat it. Not every food has to be good or bad. So I like vegetables, so eat whatever vegetables you eat. No restrictions, but make sure you eat at least 1 fruit, if not 2 fruits a day. But there is a difference on legumes. Legume consumption, the increasing legume consumption increases your productivity. So in the vegetables you eat, make sure there are some legumes. Now, why are fruits and vegetables not consumed? And all the guidelines on what the whole world should be done are written by people sitting in Geneva or in Dallas who are white, rich, and male. They are male, and so they don't know the cost of foods. They don't go and do the grocery shopping. They're white because they only think of what happens in their countries and what the rest of the world doesn't eat. So this is what each country spends on food in our study. In Canada and Sweden, which is pretty typical, the family spends only 10% of their income on food. You go to a country like Pakistan, India, Zimbabwe, 65 to 70% of their income is spent on food. And so no wonder they're going to buy the cheapest food. And this is what the other countries are at. So until we make healthy foods inexpensive and affordable, people aren't going to use it. So we then took the WHO guidelines of 2 servings of fruits and 3 servings of vegetables and said what proportion of somebody's income after taking, their whole income is spent in a family for food. In Western countries, it's tiny. That is fruits and vegetables. It's not food as a whole. Upper middle income countries, this is urban and rural, about 12 to 15%. Low-income countries, about 12 to 25%. And look at low-income countries like India, Pakistan, much of Africa, 30 to 60%. No wonder they cannot afford it. Even when they grow these foods, they do not eat it because they sell it as a cash crop to earn money. So what happens is, as the price of food increases, the consumption of fruits and vegetables decrease. And in high-income countries, it is pretty flat. People eat about 5.5 servings a day, and it's pretty flat. Middle-income countries, you're starting to see an inverse slope, and it's lower. Lower middle-income countries, it is even lower, and it's sharply declining in the low-income countries. So the conclusion of my talk is, contrary to common beliefs, the current recommendations to reduce saturated fats have no scientific basis. I'm not the only one saying this. You must have heard of the book called Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. She shook up the nutrition world, but she got it right. Did you know that the 7-country studies that actually had a straight line between fat intake and CVD is fudged? I'm using the word fudged because 23 countries participated in that study, and they took the 7 best that fitted that line, and that's what's there. If you go through the literature, you will find that they chose the 7 that fitted the line. The nutrition field has been distorted. Monounsaturated fats is protective, and in fact, a Mediterranean diet is not a low-fat, not a low-salt diet. And the PREDIMED trial, a very good trial, proves it, and we had the Lyon study before that. Carbohydrates are probably your biggest culprit. So when you eat a hamburger, throw away the bun and eat the meat. Sodium intake in the moderate range is optimal. Too low is bad, too high is bad. Fruits and legumes are not neutral, are protective, and vegetables are either slightly protected or neutral. And I haven't shown you data. In 4 studies we've done on about 200,000 people, fish is neutral. It's neither beneficial nor harmful. And the studies that show that fish is beneficial is likely a replacement issue because they are replacing other foods that are harmful. Eggs, again, are neutral. So do eat your eggs without any guilt conscience. So thank you very much.